Hey, I'm Phil.
Hey friends, Kyle here, and on today's episode Dose, we're going to be discussing pyramid schemes and God's surprising idols.
That's right, Kyle. So last episode we talked about first impressions. And so what better place to go for first impressions than the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1.
How about that? Didn't take you long to get back to Genesis, did it?
No, I am very notorious in my small circles that I have in my life, but
Perfect.
those big notorious themes of mine always come back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And I am admittedly obsessed with how not only scripture relates to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, but how life seems to keep revolving around this. So get comfy in the thoughts of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 if you're a listener of this podcast or you're watching, because themes will often come back here. But we'll spend a little bit of time on it in the next couple of episodes. At some point, we'll most certainly do a deep dive.
Sure. And what a great place to start then.
That's right.
At the beginning.
That's right. At the beginning, in the
beginning.
And so, Kyle, Genesis 1 is actually probably one of the more famous chapters of the Bible.
Sure.
People probably aren't too familiar with Habakkuk.
Right.
And people will probably gloss over if they even try to read Leviticus, right? There's a lot of obscurity in our biblical encyclopedia in our own heads, right? But Genesis 1 is up there with some of the most famous, one of the most popular aspects of the Bible.
Yeah. If there's stories that people have heard, right, wrong, or indifferent, and in different, explanations, yes, Genesis is right up there.
That's right. And so when you think of Genesis 1, when you think of creation, whether now or back when you first uncovered Genesis 1 and first uncovered thoughts of creation, what are some of the themes? What are some of the common tropes that come along with this chapter for you?
Yeah, I mean the biggest thing was, and this is just for me personally, was figuring out, can I trust this text from the very first verse in the very first chapter, which we could probably unpack for the next month.
Sure.
However, certainly the foundational piece of it is important. You think of, Adam and Eve in in the garden, and there's a whole bunch there as far as gender and whose fault was it, and the serpent. There's a lot of emotions around, even considering our own way of being, like, oh man, if Adam and Eve didn't mess up,
sure,
we could still be in this beautiful garden. And it also helps set the stage for the reality in which we find ourselves, that is a fallen world.
That's right.
And what implications does that have? And does that mess us up completely, or is there a better way to live that's not in defeat in the midst of our current reality?
You hit all the big questions, not only in Genesis 1, you actually spilled into Genesis 2 and 3 a little bit.
There you go.
Which is part of why I'm obsessed with all three chapters, because Genesis 1, 2, and 3 really do set the tone.
Right.
Really do read mostly as one story. Although I would argue there's two distinct stories within those three chapters, but that's another one for another time. And for Genesis 1 in particular, and we don't have the time to read verse by verse, I would encourage you that if you are sitting at home and you have 5 extra minutes, go ahead, read the whole of Genesis 1 here before we go on, or read it afterwards. But we're not going to do that here for time's sake. But Genesis 1, the summary here is that we have this refrain of God creating and then saying it was good. And we have this over the course of 6 days in Genesis 1. The 7th day is actually in Genesis 2, if I remember right. And this God creates good things out of his goodness, but also out of his words. This God is able to speak things into existence through the universe things, but also things like light and darkness, right? So he's creating the very earthy, rich vegetation, plants, dirt type stuff, as well as stars and light
Right,
itself.
right. From
So
atomic to celestial.
that's right, and
Yeah.
everything in between. So let me take one step back before I go into the views that I want to bring forward today. So typically what we can do with this 6-day creation and with these thoughts of a God that creates everything out of his mouth is we can frankly, in my opinion, over literalize it and draw meaning just on a historical, biological, scientific sort of way.
Mhm.
And I don't want to go down that route today about my views on or against that. I'll throw some shade, but I'm not going to actually walk into that. But what I do want to do, and what I want to attempt to do, is give us some context again around what this passage is and what it's like and what it was trying to do to the original listeners,
Right.
and then draw some meaning and even some practical thought
Mhm.
for us today.
Yeah.
So, and so right there are some of my first impressions of this, is that I typically saw it as, okay, this is a history of the universe, and God created everything in 6 literal days, and he did it by the word of his mouth. And that revealed something to me, mostly of God's power, his majesty, his glory, his ability, right? And that he really was not only a creative God, but he was the one in charge. He's the one in charge of everything else. We have a singular God acting by the power of his word to create all this. We don't have multiple gods fighting against each other. I'm spilling in the context a little bit, but there are actually, this is actually a good moment to pause. There are actually multiple ideas out there that have existed throughout the course of human history about how all this began.
Sure.
Most of them involve violence amongst multiple gods. That is the very simplest way to summarize the other creation theories and religions out there. But this God does not deal with violence that way. Which leads us into the context of Genesis 1. But any thoughts there quick before I dive in, Kyle?
No, please dive away.
All right. So the original hearers of Genesis 1 would have been, put you on the spot.
Original hearers?
Yeah. Who are the original receivers of Genesis 1?
Yeah, I have no idea.
The Israelites on the way to the promised land, right? Or maybe as they entered the promised land.
Well, and think about it like this, right? You may be following along here because you want some tactical, practical ways to take your, immense knowledge of the Bible and make it relevant to the people in your spheres of influence. Great. Or you may be in a boat that is similar to mine, where you've certainly heard a lot of the Bible stories growing up, but as far as the context, as far as having an education steeped in the history of the Bible, no. And so I would say that hindered me from building a rich relationship with the Lord for many years. So we'll address, conquering that probably a little bit later this episode. But all that to say is not knowing in this context is perfectly acceptable, right? Because, not all of us have dedicated our lives to understanding these things. And so it's wonderful. And it's also okay to not know. So now that I know that the first listeners of Genesis 1 were the Israelites, please continue.
Yes, thank you, Kyle. And I'll punctuate that too with curiosity is so much more important than knowledge itself. Like the one thing to know and the longing to know and the humility that there's more out there is more important than the nuggets that we even stumble into. In this life.
The more you know, the more questions you have, which is certainly an overarching statement that's true in many aspects of life.
And exploring these things together is part of what brought us here to hit record on podcasting too. And so yeah, I'm happy to dig in on those and meet you wherever you're at as best as we can in these sort of contexts. So and so those original hearers, the Israelites entering the promised land, they, and I'll do my best to cover things here, they were fleeing Egypt. And to this day, when we conjure up images of Egypt, we think of pyramids.
Yeah.
Pyramids are actually tombs. I don't know how common that knowledge is, but they are actually these giant tombs that were literally meant to cast shadows on the people of Egypt to remind them of the superiority of Pharaoh. Even when they're dead, they're casting a shadow on you and the land you live in, right? And they are pointing to the heavens. They are pointing to the fact that these pharaohs, that individual pharaoh, they are the individual image of Ra, the sun god. They are bringing God to the people in their very likeness and their singular human being identity, right? And their one body as a human being. And without getting into the rich history of the book of Exodus and all that, the Israelites had to flee the powerful thumb of Pharaoh that was enslaving them for over 400 years at this point. And so they're fleeing, and it's in that context of 400 years of enslavement to Pharaoh and to Egypt that the very first scriptures they encounter, right, their first impression of God,
right,
is Genesis 1. And so that is worth, I mean, feel free to hit pause now and just stew on that one a little bit to say, like, oh, what would it mean for me to encounter Genesis 1, knowing that me and the previous, I don't know, 10, 8 generations of my family have been enslaved up until reading this book this way. And that itself will give light that we can't touch in a podcast here, but worth pausing if you have a chance here to hit pause and think about that. But going forward, what God does in Genesis 1, many Jewish interpreters believe what God is doing is he's creating a temple space. There's a lot of reasoning for that. You can Google it if you'd like to do more research on that one. But what God is doing in Genesis 1 is day after day, he's formatting a temple space. So a pyramid, in a small sense, is kind of akin to a temple because it's pointing to God and it's this constant daily visual reminder of the impact that Pharaoh has as God on the people. And a temple is supposed to serve similar needs.
Right.
A temple has its adornments, its decor, its architecture, and all of these things are supposed to reflect God in some way or reflect the truths of a certain God in that way. Think about pyramids, think about Mesopotamian structures, right, that just climb up to the heavens, right, where you're supposed to meet God.
Right.
But Kyle, when you think of temples and all these different things symbolizing God or the truths of God, what is the one thing in a temple that always typifies what the God in that temple might be like?
Right. Yeah, it's always a certain level of greatness, whatever the pinnacle of that society can produce architecturally. It's packed with the finest of materials, whether that be, gold, bronze, the best artisans were selected to construct that. And to your point, it's either impressive in physical stature, in the sense that it stands out above the rest of the architecture in a particular area, whether it's flat or on a mountain or both.
That's right.
Yeah,
it's always impressive. It's always pointing to the God, right? So if you had a temple and it was the god of grain, the god of vegetation, right? You would see, wheat, you would see sunlight, you would see rain, you would have these things depicted all along the way. And as you went to the temple in one way or the other would lead you to an idol.
Right.
Or to a statue, sometimes small, sometimes big. Sometimes it would have incense being burned to it. Sometimes it would have sacrifices and altars and
whatever,
like things depicting. Yeah, if it was the light god, there'd probably be flames in some sense, candles or even larger flames, and all of it ultimately gets centered around the idol or the statue, the image of that god in stone. And you would have to bring your worship to
Right.
this god in some form, whether it's money or actions like bowing or singing, right? And
Right.
in some cultures, as we know in antiquity, even your firstborn child to the altar, right?
Sure,
So the,
sure. At the very least, a sacrifice of the best of your flock, the best
That's
of your crops, etc.
yeah. And this was always to try and please and sway that god in some sort. And if it's true, let's use the logical language here. If it's true that God in Genesis 1 is visually depicting a cosmic temple, what we have is we've got light and darkness in form being made, and then we've got vegetation being separated on land, and land is being separated from water, and then the stars are being formed. I'm summarizing all of Genesis 1 really quickly here. And then animals are created. And what we have is we've got creation becoming a little bit more complex as it rises out of the waters, and as stars are being made, there's eyes that are being made that can catch those stars in the form of the animals.
Yeah.
And the land is summing up to the sky, and animals are eclipsing these mountains, getting closer to the stars, and getting and what we should expect at the end of the creation of this temple, the last thing to be oriented would be the idol, the
Right.
image of God,
Right. Right.
himself, itself, right, whatever.
Yeah.
And in Genesis 1, what do we have? We don't have a statue. We don't have an altar. We don't have candles, flames, anything like that. We have man and woman are placed in the center of this cosmic temple.
Mm.
And this should cause us great pause, because it's not us that's supposed to be worshipped. We know that deeply in our faith, like, oh, ooh, I don't know if I
Right.
should be worshipped.
It feels weird.
So what is this passage trying to say about a cosmic temple and man and woman? You know, people just like Kyle, me, and you, right? Like, what does it say if we are the ones depicted as the idol in this temple? You have thoughts on that before I spill my thoughts, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it comes down to is an overarching, theme that I'm sure Phil and I will return to many times, but it's this idea of what we call an image bearer of God. And I'm going to stop there because there's so much to unpack, but I'll let you set the stage.
Yeah, great. Yeah, image bearing is so important to this, and that is language of Genesis 1. But part of what we should reflect on here is part of what the previous episode was about. We have a God that in his glory seeks to serve, seeks to love us, seeks to share his glory, and says, I want to serve you. I want this to be a blessing to you. And we'll get into particular ways that he does that practically in the next episode. But in this particular moment, what we are supposed to begin to see is that this God doesn't just say, I'm going to place myself at the center of the universe and everything and everyone should bow to me. Although that is a proper response when we read this, that by the power of his word, he's just creating everything and anything. But his exclamation point on everything is to share his image, to share his glory in each and every one of his human beings is completely countercultural. And as you have, the mountain of creations coming forth, and on the top of this pyramid is not one human being, the Pharaoh that represents God. It's depicted as all of human life. Because now, stemming from just two human beings made by one God, right? Like, those human beings, the first thing they're actually told is to be blessed and to multiply.
Right.
And that multiplication of human beings in the earth is the representation of this God, rather than just the normal pyramid shape where only one human being represents God. We all are God's image, and we all together are God's image, and we all individually. That's a mystery that we have to play out in all this. And so with our time remaining, Kyle, I want to take this truth, I want to take this idea and run with it in sort of a practical sense. We'll get a little bit kind of almost in a counseling sense, therapeutic sense here, but I hope that it's life-changing I don't think it's too small to say that. I hope that the way that we engage us practically here is life changing. And where I want to start is our typical identity in following Jesus and following this God of creation. Our typical go-to, at least, well, I'll speak for me. My typical go-to for most of my Christian life was, I'm just a sinner saved by grace, or some sort of iteration of that line, or some sort of melody that sings the same song as sinner saved by grace. I'm just this lowly sinner saved by grace. And you can probably hear some of the condescension in my voice, and I don't want to dispel that as not true.
Right.
It is a fact. We are sinners saved by grace.
This falls under a broader category of things that are true but not helpful.
Yes, not helpful, particularly on a therapeutic sense. Right, particularly. It is helpful in a theological sense, and we will cover those grounds for sure as we go along here. But here in Genesis 1, part of what God's doing in laying the foundation of creation is laying the foundation of our relationship with Him. And that foundation is not sinner. We're still a couple of pages away from even sin coming into the picture of the narrative of what Kyle was talking about, our cultural anthropology, to throw some big words out there. Who are we as people? Who are we as people in relationship to God and to history and to each other and our personalities and in our essence and in our minds? All that is cultural anthropology stuff. And what God says is the foundation is you are His image bearer. You are His icon and His idol and His temple. And He's going to share that glory with you. And so the foundational level is not sinner, which might be shocking to you. It's shocking to me as I continue to unwrap myself from that sinner saved by grace mentality into an image bearing mentality, and holding that tension of, when I sin, what does that mean and all that? I'm still figuring that stuff out. But for a foundational sake, what I really want you to hear, what I really want us to dig into today is, what does it mean to be His image bearer? What does it mean that God turned the pyramid upside down for us as individuals, as well as a collective body of Jesus trying to live this stuff out? And what does it mean then to take that into your everyday life?
What does it mean and what do we do with it?
Yes. And so for me, Kyle, I'll start first, and maybe you can cook on some ideas of how this has implications for you and for our listeners. For me, I am on a constant journey with my anxiety. I am in therapy regularly around this. I don't mind admitting that I have done some long work now on anxiety. And what I have come to recognize is that some of what we talked about in the last episode of this daunting God bursting through the cloud with lightning bolt in hand, I've had to dispel some of that related to my anxiety. But also it's just like, does God only view me as a sinner that has caused a lot of anxiety in me over the years, and relates to, is this why I'm sick? Is this why bad things happen? Is this why this investment went awry? Is that right?
Sure.
Like, if sinner saved by grace is the foundation of my identity with God, I am going to constantly hum at a certain RPMs of anxiety.
That constant state of forgiveness asking.
And is this not covered yet by grace? Because this foundation is sinner. You can just hear it having this negative curiosity that's always seeking meaning and seeking security out of God. When I reflect on Genesis 1, and here's the beginning of why these first 3 chapters are so meaningful to me. When I reflect on this being the foundation, capital T, capital F, the foundation to my cultural anthropology, to my identity, not just as a Christian, but as a human being, that He wants His glory to shine through me in just my being, man, all sorts of anxieties actually get washed away in the flood of knowing that He has designed this entire world in a way that I would be the reflection of God to creation. And just knowing that His image is in me, and that's the foundation, period. All sorts of anxieties go around that. I've got other thoughts on that.
Sure,
what are you cooking on, Kyle?
So many things. Look, if there's one thing that you walk away, know that not only are you, number one, an image bearer of God. But number two, if you ever have any doubts about your worth, that is a lie.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I would ask that you just take a hold of that wherever it is in your brain. And I don't think this is something that if it's deep seated, you're not just going to conquer it in
That's
one
true.
shot.
Yeah.
This is something that you need to grab and you need to choke the life out of, because it's literally choking the life out of you. Okay. So, this has so many implications about how we move through the world, because now, instead of judging that person at the checkout counter, or I'll speak for myself, judging that person for not being quick enough off the red light.
Sure.
If I quickly switch to a love-centered lens that says, hey, that person's an image bearer. Wow. How much more patience, how much more grace am I able to extend? So this has far-reaching implications about how you interact with others. But coming back to how do I walk through the world? This piece, not only does it remove much anxiety, but it removes a lot of fear.
That's right.
Right? And I'll underscore this with a very simple explanation. There's somebody that I've mentored for many years, and they always grew up being taught you need to ask for forgiveness every night before you go to sleep, because you never know if something happens in the middle of the night, where you're going to wind up, right? And again, asking for forgiveness when you know that you have not lived properly, that's a good thing. I'm not saying that you remove that part of this relationship with God and staying in right relationship. What I am saying is that knowing you're an image bearer gives you a certain boldness in how you move through life. So now when that underlying energy of anxiety or up to and including fear tries to creep in, you can stomp that down and move forward knowing what your worth is. So I'm going to stop there, because that's a whole hour's worth of content there. But I'll end with this. You are unique, you are special, you are created. And I'm not talking about a little self-esteem pat on the back,
Sure.
Good for you. Here's what I'm saying. If you're not in the brightest of places now, it may feel as if you're alone, and I will not discount that. But what I will say is go back to your identity and understand that you are never alone. And I would encourage you to continue to do this walk by yourself. And even though it's hard, start to find other people in a community. Start here and walk along if you want to understand that more deeply. I invite you into what it feels like to have your paradigm shifted about your worth and about who you are and about your state of forgiveness.
Yeah, that's really good, Kyle. There's a phrase that says, not all that glitters is golden. And there's a certain part of our religiosity that can say, oh, like, I'm good with God, and I ask for forgiveness every night. I go to church and all this.
Right.
And it glitters with a sense of what our Christianity or our faith, our religion might be.
Sure.
But the real gold is not having anxiety. The real gold is actually knowing that you're loved and the beloved of God, that you are his image bearer. And that's why we keep repeating this language, because you can anchor your soul in the fact that first and foremost, you're an image bearer. It all comes back to me, Kyle, with something that Jesus said around anxiety, actually. He says, do you see the birds? The birds, they never ask where their next meal is coming from. They don't have silos full of grain. They don't have Chipotle gift cards that they're stocking up and making sure that they have on a rainy day. No, I feed them every day, and you're worth more than these sparrows. Do you see the flowers? Like they don't collect their Kohl's cash
Right,
and,
right.
and go into debt on their credit cards, just trying to get the next best pair of jeans or shoes or whatever. I clothe them with my glory, and you're worth way more than the lilies of the field. But seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. That's the goal. Right? The goal is seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. And what is that kingdom and what is that righteousness? It's a kingdom that is upside down and places you as the image bearer, not just some priest, not some pastor, not some podcaster. It places you as the beloved image bearer of God. And you get to participate that on a deep level, but then also on what I will call in the next episode a vocational level, an active level. How do we actually participate with God when we know that this truth of being his image bearer is deep in our soul and deep in our bones? What we do with that energy. Right. So may you deeply trust in your image bearing nature being the foundation of your identity as you participate in the mission of God.
Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.